But the Antichrist, we know, is going to be in a category all to himself, and that's what I believe we read here. His only God will be a God of fortresses, verse 38. Keep in mind, dear friends, that the focus of Daniel 11, 36 through 39 is upon the self-deification of the Antichrist and his blasphemies against the true God. And his preoccupation will be to try to gain power. In Daniel 11, in verse 7, 10, 19, 31, and 39, we have mention of fortresses. This will be his obsession to gain power. And in verse 38, we read, he will honor a God of fortresses, a God whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. So in other words, he will spend his treasure in order to gain this power, the God of fortresses. I'm convinced that the Antichrist will be a Gentile. You will recall in Luke 21, 24, Jesus referred to this time as the time of the Gentiles, indicating that a Gentile will be in a position of ruling during this time. And I believe it's incongruent to have Satan empowering a Jew to be the final ruler of the times of the Gentiles when the Gentiles are going to be trampling down the Jews. Remember also that the Antichrist is going to lead a European alliance, a revived Roman Empire of Gentile nations. And all of the rulers of these nations are described in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. And it would make no sense to me to assume that the Antichrist, whose kingdom bears the identity of the Roman Empire, would be anything other than a Gentile. Moreover, the description of Daniel chapter 11 parallels the character of other arch-enemies of Israel, all of which have been Gentiles. Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. You have Titus and Hadrian and many other Roman and Muslim and European rulers like Hitler, and Stalin, and so forth. And I would also add, if you do believe that the Antichrist will be Jewish, and certainly this is not a test of orthodoxy here, but you might want to be careful because this is supremely offensive to Jewish people. This fuels the flames of the ancient blood libel, allegations of human sacrifices upon the altar. In fact, this fuels the most virulent strain of anti-Semitism around the world that has motivated Christians down through history to persecute Jews, and also has motivated many Muslims. It's hard to know where this originated, but we do know, for example, that one of the church fathers, John Chrysostom, in the 4th century A.D., taught that the Antichrist would be a Jew, and he would come from the cursed tribe of Dan, he believed. And so many people began to believe in that day and down through time that Jews were nothing more than these inveterate murderers possessed by the devil. And of course, you know how things grow. The blood libel begins to grow, and before you know it, you've got people groups that believe that the Jews sold themselves to Satan, and they're worse than apes, as many of the Muslims believe, and that some have grown horns, and they're committed to enslaving all of the non-Jewish world. So again, if you hold that view, be very careful. Now I want you to notice the likeness of the beast to the one who empowers him. And at the end of verse 1, he has 10 horns and 7 heads. It's interesting, we have almost an identical description of Satan in chapter 12 and verse 3, where we read, the great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. Now we know biblically that horns are emblematic of great strength and power. And in this symbolism, we see that the beast will rule over 10 kings of 10 nations. In Daniel chapter 7, verses 16 and following, we discover that the number 10 is emblematic of the great political and military power of the Antichrist. And ultimately, according to Daniel 7, verse 23, he will rule over the whole world. And there he is pictured as the 4th beast, who will be a fourth kingdom on the earth. And this, dear friends, is a description that links him to the fourth kingdom of Daniel's vision of the statue of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. You remember that? In Daniel 2. And of course, that kingdom is the kingdom of Rome. And there we read that it will have legs of iron, yet its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. And then later on we read how this will be the one where a stone will be cut without hands, a picture of Christ, and it will strike on its feet of iron and clay and crush it. Verses 33 and 34. So the Lord tells us through John's vision that this beast has 10 horns, symbolic of this revived Roman Empire. And it also has 7 heads. And this is representative of 7 successive world empires. We read more of this in Revelation 17. That of Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, and then finally the kingdom of the Antichrist. And notice on his 10 horns were 10 diadems. Diadema in Greek, it's a reference to the kind of crown that marked the regal status of a subordinate king. And this is symbolic of the regal authority associated with the 10 rulers and their empires, all of which will be subordinate to the beast. And finally, we see that on his heads were blasphemous names. And of course, these names will demonstrate their allegiance to the beast, whom they will deify, rather than the one true God. This was also practiced in the days of the Roman Empire, where emperors would use various divine titles and place them on various parts of their clothing and crowns. Well, obviously, such an inscription is tantamount to blasphemy. So we see his demonic origin. Next, let's turn secondly to his world empire, verse 2. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. Now, the imagery here is rooted in Daniel 7, where Daniel portrays 4 beasts. One is a lion, one is a bear, one is a leopard, and then the 4th beast, which is a composite of the other 3, is described in verse 7 as dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong. That will be the empire of the Antichrist. Now here in Revelation, it's interesting that John lists these animals in reverse because he is looking back into history, whereas when Daniel described them, he was looking forward into the future. These 3 animals, the leopard, the bear, and the lion, symbolize the ferocious, vicious power of these 3 successive world empires of Neo-Babylonia, Medo-Persia, and Greece. But the 4th beast, representing the Roman Empire, is emblematic of the final empire of the Antichrist that will incorporate all of the cruelty and all of the power of the first 3. Beloved, this will be an empire that is unparalleled in human history. Having watched our last presidential election, it's easy to see how quickly people can abandon all logic and common sense and worship a man. And what we have witnessed in the United States is repeated over and over again in many other countries. It's been that way down through history. It's interesting that when people are afraid and they're desperate and they're unsure about the future, they quickly turn to some man that they think will give them the answers rather than turning to God. Every dictator in history preys upon the fears of the people in order to help them rise to power. You will recall that Adolf Hitler seized upon the depressed economy and the fears of the German people, and he promised them peace with honor, peace for our time, and they bought it, and the rest is history.